So welcome everyone to this session. I always fiddle with these titles, so I always think, what is a title that people might deem useful? And that seemed like one, so I tricked you into attending, so that worked. I actually believe I'm going to be talking about not so much architecture, rather architectural work, but I hope you'll get what you're looking for out of this session. My name's Stefan. I've included a single slide on the company background, you know, the kind of marketing slide that I typically avoid. I think it's kind of reasonable this time because I want you to have some context about where I come from. So I work with a company that does a lot of architectural consulting, but also a lot of development work. So about 80% of our revenue actually comes from delivering software in client projects with mixed teams or completely on our own. So it's a variety of different projects where we not only come up with some sort of architectural guideline, we also suffer the consequences, which I think is pretty important because I want you to have the feeling that it's not only theory that I'm talking about. So if you want to find out more, we do have a booth, and please visit us there. And I'm going to get to my actual content, which is recommendations for how to arrive at a practical architecture. I've collected 10 recommendations. I believe those are the key insights that I've gathered over the last, sadly, decades. So let's dive right into that. So my first one, you might have seen me present slides similar to these a number of times, is to actually make a conscious choice what it is you're talking about. And I believe that is, like many of these things, kind of obvious in hindsight. It seems like a natural thing to do, yet it's not at all common. I see people violating this principle a lot of times. So what do I mean by that? In my view, you have a number of different things that you want to achieve when you do architectural work. Let's start with something like this. This is a very ugly context diagram, right? So you have that thing that you're focusing on in the middle, and you have other stuff around it. And it's kind of an obvious thing that probably everybody has learned during their career, that you figure out what's in your scope and what's out of scope, right? What are the things that you connect to? What is the stuff that you don't have to take care of? What are the connections? How do you handle the interfaces? This kind of context diagram is sort of a common ground. That's what everybody does, right? But as soon as you ask people about the next step, let's zoom in, let's look into that thing. What kind of diagram do you get? What's the typical result that you get when you ask people to draw a picture of their architecture? So my guess is what most of you have seen is one of those diagrams of three, you know, 3 tiers or 3 layers. There's a database, there's some logic, there's presentation. And you might have that thing skipped by 90 degrees, rotated 90 degrees, then it's more like boxes, right? You have 3 tiers, there's a cylinder and 2 boxes. Like Ted Newert used to say, every architecture diagram ever, box, box, cylinder. And that's kind of very sad, because what I believe should be at the next level is something like this. Now, don't take this too literally. I'm not suggesting that this is the perfect architecture for an e-commerce system. What I'm saying is that if I'm focusing on this perspective, I'm actually looking at business aspects. I'm looking at a modularization of that thing according to some domain logic, right? That's why we like to call this particular view domain architecture. So essentially what I'm doing here is I'm focusing on how to decompose the thing into logical units. There's no technology involved here. I'm not talking about, you know, are these modules or subsystems or applications or whatever. It doesn't really matter. That's a different perspective, right? At this perspective, I'm making a conscious decision to subdivide things into these particular components. There could be different number. It doesn't have to be 6, could be 15 components or 3 or 1 in very rare occasions if you're building something that's really, really small, right? So that's the first conscious decision about your domain architecture. And there's another decision that you have to make, which is about how these things collaborate, how they integrate, how they form a consistent whole. And that's, to a certain degree at least, independent from how many boxes you chose and exactly how they're labeled and what they're responsible for, right? You have these things and they collaborate in some way, so you're rather focusing on the surroundings as opposed to the individual boxes, and we like to call that macro architecture. That might have something like, this is the way we operate stuff, this is how we monitor and trace, this is how we do the UI integration, this is how we do interprocess communication, whatever it is, right? That's the second perspective. And I hope you'll see that these two perspectives are quite different. They're probably maintained or elaborated by different people. There might be collaboration, and there hopefully is collaboration between people who do that, but it's like a different role. And even if you're a single person responsible for those two perspectives, it still pays to be aware of what it is you're currently talking about, because these things change with different frequencies and for very different reasons. And that's even more true with the third perspective. Now, I've picked arbitrary technology choices to implement those boxes. Again, doesn't matter at all. I just picked different ones and tried to include some that would possibly annoy you. I don't know. So whatever it is that you choose here is sort of an internal decision within each box. There's a number of assumptions here, like these boxes are individual systems or have to be individual systems or services for this to work. Otherwise, you'll probably have less flexibility there. Whatever, doesn't really matter. This is the sort of view that is more of a micro view. It's like the internal view of that particular single component or subsystem or self-contained system, whatever it is that you choose as your architecture, microservice, I don't care. What's important to me is that you should be aware what the focus of each perspective is. The point of a perspective is to put one thing in your laser sharp focus. This is what we're talking about now. And if you're talking about integration architecture between independent systems, you have a different focus than when you're talking about their internal implementation choices. And as soon as you mix them up, as soon as some internal micro choice leaks into a different perspective, such as the macro architecture, you tie yourself to an internal implementation decision on the wrong level for the wrong reason. My favorite kind of weird example is inter-process communication. So I don't know how many of you did stuff like RPC or web services. Most of you probably did do RESTful or more or less RESTful HTTP kinds of things. So whatever you do, there are all these fantastic frameworks that help you build these things very easily. And they very often introduce a leak like that. And there's this implementation detail that you're not aware of that now becomes part of your interface, which means that 5 years down the road, you won't be able to change that implementation detail because it's now part of your integration layer, right? So be aware of those perspectives and act accordingly. That's my first recommendation. If I go through all of them and that speed, we'll never finish. So I'll speed up a bit and go to the one that's most closely related to this particular one, which is a discussion about the team setup. And that might not seem something like software architects should care about, and that might not seem something that architecture is relevant for, unless you've seen Conway's Law somewhere, which you probably have, because everybody keeps talking about it for the last 10 years or so. So if you look again at my simple example here, we have those boxes, and those boxes actually might have a relation to a team setup. So for example, I might end up assigning 3 teams and split those boxes or distribute those boxes to those teams. What you'll notice here is that no team boundary cuts a box into 2 parts, because that would seem kind of stupid, right? That's not what you do. You've architected things this way so that you can do this, right? That's why it's such an important choice, and that is why it's not something that you should let happen to you, right? Should be a conscious decision that you make because you want to achieve something, like the ability to have these 3 teams work independently, at least to a certain degree. They'll have these integration aspects, but they'll largely be able to make their own decisions and do their own work. And if you change things, you'll probably change them along the lines of those integration boundaries, right? So for example, if that reddish team has too much work, I might split it into 2. And the reason I can do that is because it's 2 systems. Right? So even though it was 1 team to start with and I wouldn't have had to make it 2 systems, the fact that I made it 2 systems allows me to change my mind later, which is, I think that's number 10 or so, probably the most important thing, right? You should enable yourself to change your mind. You're going to be really, really thankful to yourself if you do that. And you're going to hate yourself if you don't. So keep that in mind. I'm actually talking about team architecture, and I think that's part of architectural work. And I mentioned Conway's Law, but that's not the only thing. There's a number of initiatives, a number of communities that have discovered this or elaborated on it. And my most favorite thing at the moment about this is Team Topologies, which many of you probably know. It's a pretty great book. I can strongly recommend it. And it actually puts the team setup, it's sort of, you could say, does team-driven development or team-driven project management, like that's the most important thing. How do you set up your teams? How do they collaborate, right? So they come up with a bunch of fundamental topologies, that's what they call them, and a bunch of interaction modes that might exist between these different kinds of components. Everyone's favorite kind of team is this streamlined team. You might know them as cross-platform, interdisciplinary teams, value stream teams, right? These streamlined teams, they're the ones who really have business purpose, right? They know what they're doing for the end user, the client, right? They deliver value and they're aligned on that. But you need a bunch of others as well. I'm very briefly going to mention a few disagreements I have with that, maybe to have some discussion later on. So there are some things that I don't like that much about the book, like they use this term cognitive load. And I've since learned that that's a little, I don't know, it's not really what it's used for like that, so whatever. That's maybe something. The other one that I don't really like is the limitation on those 4 things and the strictness with which they do it. It's these 4 types of teams. And that's it, right? I think that's kind of a bold statement, and you should allow yourself to have maybe a different kind of team if that fits your organization. And the same is, of course, true for the interactions. They also say it's actively harmful to have other team. Well, I don't know. I don't agree with those bold statements. Having said that, it's a great book, and I strongly recommend it because there are many things that I really like about it. This team first thing is really cool. Of course, and we'll get to that, it matters in bigger projects, right? If your project is 3 people working for 3 months, don't bother with any of this. This is more for the largish things where you have like, I don't know, maybe 50 people working on something, or 25 even, then it just makes sense. This idea of autonomy is appearing again and again in my recommendations here, this idea of having local agency, of being able to do something that makes sense, that has purpose on its own. It's like, to me, the most motivating thing that you can have in software delivery, no matter what your role is, right? And enabling teams to do that is really a key thing to me. The book's also completely technology agnostic, so no need to do microservices to do it, although of course you can, or pick any other technology choice here. I also like the focus on long-lived teams, so that's a shift we've seen during the last, I don't know, the company's now been there for 25 years, almost. So we've seen a shift from things where a project is something that is, an exception, that's supposed to end as quickly as possible so that you can get to the state where you don't have any projects running. We've shifted from that mindset to something where you always improve and always add new things because your business is essentially depending on innovation within the services that support it. So long-lived teams, I like that. It's also based on actual experience. It grew from a community effort where a lot of people talked about how they have set up their teams. So it's really grounded in actual experience. A really good book, strongly recommend it. Now, I mentioned that this is something that you should care about if you have a larger team, and that is just one example of something that is true for any sort of architectural choice that you make, which is that whatever you do needs to match your context. So every time you pick some solution from one context and just apply it to a different one without considering whether it's a match, you're going to end up with a mess. And that seems, again, totally obvious, but it's not. There are so many people who run a company that makes, I don't know, 25 million in revenue and has 50 employees and 10,000 customers and copies the architecture from Facebook or Netflix, which is not comparable. That's a different kind of business. If you run a streaming video business for 500 million people, by all means, copy Netflix's architecture. If you don't, maybe don't. Right? So the same is true for your organizational setup as well. Now, what do I mean by organizational setup? I'm mostly talking about the architecture aspect here because that's my focus. Right? So when you do that, you have a number of choices, and it depends on the size of your project. Right? If you have a single team, then of course architecture matters, and you have an architecture whether you want it or not. There's nothing you can do about that. It's always there. It's a property of the system or a sum of a set of properties of the system. But in this single team setup, there probably won't be an explicit architect, right? Because he or she would not be busy with architecture stuff all the time. They're developing probably, right? So this is more like some tasks are architecture tasks, and maybe you can be aware of that, you can share them in the team. That's actually a very nice setup. I love single team projects. I love small projects. I like them much better than big ones. My guess is most people do. Still, we have bigger projects, some of them stupidly so, some of them because you just need them, right? Because you can't build stuff with these small teams in all cases. So if you have a small number of collaborating teams, you might actually see this architecture thing as something that's necessary, like a necessary evil. You have to synchronize somehow. So maybe you focus on the teams, but you send somebody to some, I don't know, some weekly meeting, right? It's the weekly architecture meeting where people talk about stuff that's kind of important for everyone, or where you maybe exchange best practices, excuse me, where you exchange or talk about best practices, or where you talk about interfaces or common standards of some kind, right? And it's basically everybody who does their work in the teams, and very occasionally some people go to this kind of architecture thing. So that's also something that works. There is the kind of project where that doesn't work. It's a larger number, or you might have different contractors, you might have different needs, different locations, and you might actually end up with an explicit architecture role. It might be one person or a group of people, and those people ideally are then also integrated to the teams. So the worst setup that I know is a separate architecture team that only does architecture, never actually talks to anybody. That's a sure recipe for disaster. So ideally, you have that team, but they also integrate with the individual teams, right? They at least collaborate with them or talk to them, or maybe are partially assigned to one or more teams. So which of these things you pick is strongly dependent on your overall organizational setup, right? There's no right or wrong here. And again, I know that many people hate these super large projects for very good reasons, but sometimes they exist for good reasons, and you have to figure out how to deal with them. So that's part of the job as well. Unless you just focus on the small 3-person projects, which is more power to you, perfectly fine. So think of those different kinds of teams or different kinds of organizations when I talk about some of the stuff that I'm going to get to, right? Some of it applies to larger organizations, but most applies to all of them. Now let's assume, that's a big assumption, but let's assume you agree with this idea of autonomous teams, right? You have these multiple teams, each responsible for a certain part of the system, ideally an end-to-end responsibility. What does that mean for the kinds of decisions that you do? And here my recommendation is that some things need to be decided centrally. Right? For some things, that autonomy is not the right thing. Right? Sometimes you have to do that. Now, this is the kind of thing where, depending on the audience, if I knew you better, I could also argue for the exact opposite of this, right? But I'm just assuming that you already bought the autonomous thing, that I don't have to convince you of that, so I'm trying to pull you a little back into the other direction. So things that might need to be decided centrally, or no, forget the might. Things that need to be decided centrally include what to centralize. I mean, you can do like a vote if you like that kind of, but I don't think that's going to work, right? Somebody has to set things up in a way to enable this autonomy, right? That's the first thing. That's true for the setup, which teams exist, and also what responsibilities do they have, right? Because if you just give them names, they might still have overlapping responsibilities for good or for bad reasons, but you somehow have to figure that out. At least with a first draft, that's definitely going to be wrong, but gets you off the ground so that you can start, right? If you have ever been in a project where 20 people start on day one, you know that experience, right? Nobody knows what they're supposed to do, and and everybody can talk to everybody else, but nothing's starting because there's no structure yet, right? So you typically have this kind of sprint zero kind of thing where you set up a few things so that you have ideas on what to work on in parallel, which I think is very, very important. Now, things that need to be decided centrally as well are those things that are relevant at the seams, especially if it's more than one team. If it's an interface between two teams, they could sort of bilaterally agree on something. But if it's something that occurs more often, you get this explosion of individual interactions or negotiations, so you better decide that centrally. And there are also some things, and we'll get to that later on, that are necessary or strategic or whatever. And the little asterisk is there for whatever value that has. I mean, that's again an organizational thing, right? So what's relevant, what's strategic, I don't know. There's no generic answer to that. You have to make up your mind. We'll get into a bit more detail about this aspect a little later on. So some things need to be decided centrally. And I also think it needs to be clear that these things are somewhat stable, at least for a time period. Right? So you probably all know these discussions that keep being reopened every time you think you've finalized your decision on that, you put them away, and a week later somebody starts with that again. Sometimes that's perfectly fine, but at least for a working period, maybe a few weeks, you should work with some stable structure just to get experience with that, and then make a decision whether it's maybe wrong, and there should be more or fewer of those particular things. So some aspects you want to decide centrally. Also, and that is something that I've observed specifically in people who listen to people like me at conferences, is that they come back with a lot of enthusiasm and want to apply things, right? So my advice in that regard is that you need to pick your battles wisely. And you should not try to do everything at the same time. So what do I mean by battles? Not physical battles, obviously, rather intellectual ones. So maybe the environment you're coming to has an existing system or an existing mindset or an existing setup or an existing organization. And all these things might be on your agenda, right? You might want to change their programming language, maybe even only the version of the programming language, or a different version on the same a different language on the same runtime. You might want to change the database model that they have because the one they have, they're clearly struggling with, or you are clearly struggling with. Maybe there's a cloud migration going on, or you want to change your UI strategy, or switch your messaging standards, or whatever the hype is. I don't really care. Whatever it is, some of that stuff might make a ton of sense. Maybe even all of it, or the other way around, right? So if you go from alternative models back to RDBMS, that's fine as well. If that's your strategy, fine. What I'm arguing for is if you try to do everything at once, you'll fail. So decide what the most important aspect is for you, specifically in a migration project, right? So don't put off some battles to next year, right? So next year you're going to talk, but the most important aspect right now is this particular thing, so focus on that. That is also, to me, a recognition of the nature of architectural work, right? Architecture is an ongoing thing. This idea of somebody creates an architecture and then hands it over to developers for them to implement is kind of the stupidest idea ever. It's like it has never worked anywhere, and it's never going to work anywhere, right? So that is not how you successfully build, at least not business software. So I'm not a developer, I don't know, mission critical nuclear fission reactor control software, so maybe things are completely different there. But for business software, what I assume most of us build, things are a lot more fluid, so you'll end up with a different strategy there. Now, if you apply the perspective idea to the timeline, you'll see that your perspective is your immediate things and your midterm and your long-term things, right? You have different perspectives and different goals for those different needs, and that's also part of your architectural assessment of what to do or not to do. Okay. The sixth one is also related to the centralization aspect. Now, there's this very interesting aspect there. So you probably figured that I am a firm believer in this autonomy thing, right? I really, really like that. I like this idea. But to enable this kind of work where people can act largely on their own or within their small peer group with the people they go to lunch with or that fit on a normal sized screen in a Zoom call, whatever it is that you use to collaborate, if you're in that small group, you can make very efficient decisions, you can work really nicely, you get into a flow, that's really cool. So that's awesome. But to get that, you need rules. Autonomy requires rules. Otherwise you end up in chaos. And that those very few rules, they need to be enforced very rigidly, right? So I have my favorite architect with a quote here. I think there is a certain degree of freedom that you want to give people, right? That's awesome. But you have to make a conscious decision where that ends, right? Because if everybody can do everything, it's not a good choice as well. So maybe you'll end up with something like this. Now, that is an arbitrary selection of check marks that I've put here, And this particular project that I invented for this slide made this particular decision. Now, every one of those things that's in the standardized column should be you should make that decision with a very skeptical mind. Do I really need to standardize it? Is it really important? Is the programming language something that I should standardize? Maybe not. Maybe this is the better model. I don't know. Nobody knows who doesn't know your project or setup. Right? You'll have to figure out where to draw that boundary. But remember, you're dealing with this very complex, multidimensional decision space thing, and you tend to forget that. If you look at this thing, it's very tempting to look at it from today's perspective. And if I look at it from today's perspective, it makes very little sense to use different programming languages. If I have, let's say I have 25 people in 3 teams, all building some sort of, I don't know, business decision support system, transactional system. Will I say every team can use whatever programming language they like? Probably not. Right? That's not a reasonable thing. I'll probably standardize so that I can move people freely between teams and exchange best practices and, you know, have them attend the same conference instead of 3 different ones. That all makes sense. But what about 5 years from now? 5 years from now, will I have a team that uses a different language? Maybe I use Java today. 5 years from now, will it be Kotlin or Scala or whatever? I don't really know. So what does that mean for today? For today, it means I can recommend that they use it. I can even enforce it in this sort of less rigid way, but I should not make it part of the overall standardized thing. Or I should at least be very careful about doing that, right? So there's a third possible column that you can use here, and that's the best practice column. So you can have something that is useful for everyone, that people can apply, and that's sort of the default, and people will probably do that, but they don't rigidly have to. So it's a bit like a quid pro quo deal, right? So you as the centralized architect or architecture team talk to those individual teams, say, okay, let's make a deal. I'll keep it to a very, very small amount of rules, very, very few of them, but I will enforce them very rigidly, and you all agree that I will throw, I don't know, cat feces at you if you violate one of those rules. But on the other hand, you can do whatever you want as long as you adhere to those rules. That's kind of the deal. And that's probably something that's acceptable. Yet still, here's the best practice implementation of this particular thing. It's there, it's open source or internally open sourced or available. You can use it if you want to, you don't have to. If you don't use it, you'll have to build your own. And that's an approach that I've seen working a lot of times. Even to a degree where people actually open source the stuff that they wanted to share between teams. So that was the philosophy that it's mostly technical stuff that you want to share, and it gets better quality if you open source it publicly. So if you want to reuse something across team boundaries, make it an open source project and convince people to actually use it, which has also the nice aspect that it competes with every other open source project out there, so you'll not end up building useless stuff, because there's more useful stuff out there already built by somebody else. Now, having said that, again, remember, it's always, all this architecture stuff is always a trade-off between competing interests. So there are some things you might want to enforce with other means, like, I don't know, maybe, let's pick my favorite thing, accessibility. I care very, very much about accessibility. I hate it when people forget that that exists. I hate it when people build interfaces that suck and are not usable by people who are different. That's like, especially if it's done out of ignorance. I hate that with a passion. So, if I find a way to enforce that, like I do an accessibility assessment of some plan, I do an accessibility assessment of a UI before it gets deployed into production, I think that's a good thing. And is that architecture? I think it is, because that stuff is very deeply ingrained and very hard to add later on, right? So if architecture is the sum of the stuff, where it's hard to change your mind, then this accessibility stuff definitely belongs in there. And you can make the same case for compliance and security and privacy by design, all of those things, right? Those are concerns, aspects, cross-cutting concerns that you need to enforce in some way. They probably don't mean that you build a library or a framework, but they might mean that you do education or assessments or training, whatever, right? You pick a way to achieve those things. Okay. My next one is a little different than the others. So I'll have to explain what I mean by that. Now, something that I've said is, that I've observed is that architecture is just as prone to being reduced to a tool problem as any other concern we have in IT, right? So people pick a tool and make the tool the center of the decision. And that can be a methodology, that can be a development tool or a design tool, can be a notation, can be any of those things, right? And to me, the reason I'm bringing this up is that I've seen a number of projects where people equate architecture with documentation, right? So if you have this system that sucks, documenting it fantastically will not improve it, right? That's not what's going to happen. So if you bring in an external architect, and that happens to us occasionally, people bring us in and say, we need you to document our architecture. That's incredibly hard for us to do, because when we do that, we notice what's wrong. There's always something wrong. It's like you bring in an auditor, everybody finds something, sometimes more, sometimes less, but you always find something. To me, the architect's role is not documenting other people's decisions, just statically. That's a very prescriptive thing. In fact, I think that's why enterprise architecture fails so very often, because it's very hard on the level that do you know what an enterprise architect is in large companies, right? These people who build these giant diagram walls that nobody ever looks at. Do you know what I mean? These huge things. They have fantastic plotting skills or diagramming skills, but nobody cares about their diagrams. And that's a really sad thing, because it wastes so much human energy on something that is not actually useful. So don't do that. Don't just describe stuff. Documenting is a fantastic thing. Documenting what exists is a great start, but it's not the end goal, right? So when you're in that position, try to make yourself an active agent, either by deciding something or by supporting decisions or by offering advice, but make a difference, right? If you don't change, if you just document, okay, I'll take all of that back. If you come into some place and everything's perfect, then it's okay to just document it. So every time that happens to you, only documenting is fine. Every other time, which means always, it's not the goal, right? So what exists is start, but not the end goal. I think that is very much related to a human thing, which is that decision-making is not always easy. In some ways it is, right? You can decide that or that. That might be just, a yes or no, but you actually have to live with that decision. You have to defend that decision. You actually have to argue with people, because if it's a decision that matters, then it's definitely not the case that everybody will agree. That's not happening, right? It is something that people will strongly disagree with. So you better prepare that decision really well and enable yourself to defend it and to argue why it's good, and even change your mind if it turns out that you're wrong, right? But that's a way more challenging thing than just documenting what somebody else did, right? And a lot of projects on different levels suffer from indecisiveness, suffer from the fact that nobody actually could bring themselves to make that friggin' decision, right? That's a total waste, right? You have different frameworks for the same thing, different UI approaches, different integration approaches. Yeah. If you compromise, it'll only avoid conflicts now, but it'll hurt you really badly later, right? So don't get around decision-making by just deciding on the superset of everybody's suggestions, right? Yeah, so we'll just do it. Yeah. It seems, as I said, many of those things seem so very, very obvious, right? But they're not. They're definitely not. Make decisions and encourage other people to actually make that. I think I had that term ADRs somewhere here. So ADRs, in case you don't know, are architectural decision records. It's a great concept. That essentially means you write down what you decided and why you decided it and what other options you considered but decided against. Right? Just making that, writing that down helps you think, helps you argue with other people, helps other people to understand why you made that, and you can make it part of your version history. You just check it in along with the source code, and somebody can read that, at that point in time they made that decision because of that. Because if they're going to revisit that decision 3 years from now, it's very useful to know why it was decided like that back then, right? Because there might be new facts or new tools or new approaches, new technologies that allow for a better and different decision today than 3 years ago. But if you don't know why they decided that, it's kind of likely that you're deciding for the wrong reason. Right? So ADRs are a very helpful thing. Again, nothing against documentation or ADRs or any of the great documentation tools that exist out there. Again, I'm only stating the obvious. This is Captain Obvious speaking to you, right? This is also, it should be totally obvious, and I think it is obvious in software development these days. So people assume basically that people develop in an agile mode, and you get this iterative development, and it grows some stuff. But it's not as obvious that this is true for architecture as well. So Mike Nygaard has a fantastic set of talks from a few years ago in a blog post, at a podcast, and lots of content. If you Google for architecture without an end state, you'll find him arguing this particular point, which is very much along the lines of this change over the course of time, right? You're not architecting for a snapshot for a particular point in time, you're architecting for a series of changes across time. And that should be on your mind. And it should be on your mind without controlling it completely, because otherwise you're going to fall into the other trap, right? You're not supposed, this does not mean you're supposed to build something that'll not have to change for 10 years. It means that you should accept that that is not a thing that you can do, and rather build stuff so that it can change in certain aspects without making it too flexible. Did I mention that architecture work is a trade-off kind of thing? It absolutely is, right? But I think this is a good perspective on the whole thing. And speaking of change, the next to last recommendation that I have is to not only consider the runtime aspects when you talk about architecture. I believe when we're architecting, I hate that verb, but if we're architecting, if we're creating an architecture, if we're doing architectural work, then we're as much working for the development pipeline as for the runtime environment. So our architectural decisions strongly influence how people collaborate, how they can work, how they can deliver value, right? So I've had this thing, I've tried unsuccessfully for a number of years to turn this into a law, like Tilkov's law. Nobody bites the saucer. So you get it without that. So I still believe it's true. I think you can assess the quality of an architecture by looking at the bottlenecks. And the more bottlenecks it creates, the worse it is. And the inverse is true as well, right? If you can avoid bottlenecks, your architecture is typically better. This independence, this flow, this delivery capacity, throughput of things that you drew on a whiteboard to actual production, getting that to flow is, I think, a very important concern for architectural work, and very often neglected, because some other concerns like this control of centralized aspects are much easier to do if you accept bottlenecks, right? If you have a centralized reviewing instance, if you have a centralized, I don't know, quality checking flow, whatever, then of course it's easier, right? If you do this particular sign-up thing here, it's easier to enforce certain things, but it'll also slow down your overall architecture. So, and again, autonomy helps speed, chaos will slow you down. So again, trade-off thing as usual, right? I've tried to sum it up with this. I think if you're an architect, your goal is to not be in the way of other people, right? You should enable them. You should try to set something up that will take you out of people's daily lives. Then you've succeeded. Right? You should only be involved in exceptional cases. Ideally, you're an architect who develops. So you spend most of your time doing development work, and only occasionally you need to put in your architect's hat and talk about this architectural aspect, because somebody needs to make a decision, and if nobody else can agree, then you just make that, and then you can continue developing. Awesome setup, not always possible, but I really like it. Okay. So we'll get to my last one, and that's very dear to my heart as well. And that is the call to be boring, right? So do less of that fancy stuff, transcend the fanciness. Right? Don't do all of that clever shit that you learn at some conference, because most of the time it's not useful. So what do I mean by that? I mean in theory, right? In theory, architects are supermen and superwomen, and they do consider the context. They analyze quality requirements, right? The things that we used to call non-functional requirements until we figured out that name sucks. So quality requirements, we analyze them and we figure out the actual business motivation. We understand the domain and everything, and then we pick a suitable development methodology, one that fits that particular context, and implementation technology, right? That's what we do. That's why we as human intelligences do that. We continuously re-evaluate what we do, right? And we take a critical look at our past decisions and correct them if they were wrong. Now, that's theory. We all know that practice might be a little different, and in practice, sometimes it reminds me a bit of this. And all you recognize that by the font and the whole thing. But you know, if I prompt that beast with a reasonable e-commerce architecture with a few words thrown in, it'll give me something that looks a lot like an architecture, right? It's very good at pretending to know something or understand. It doesn't, of course, we all know that, but it produces, so this is ChatGPT, and if you didn't figure it out, it produces these 3 layers, and it has these 3 more. And overall, this architecture is designed to be scalable, flexible, and resilient, can help the e-commerce system handle large volumes of traffic and data. What's not to like? Right? I mean, that's fantastic. And I can even ask it, what about data mesh? And it'll give me a fantastic introduction why a data mesh is absolutely required and the right thing here. Now, why do I believe that architectural work will be made obsolete by LLMs? I do not. I absolutely do not. But the reason I do not think that is because I think we should not be acting that way. If all we do is that, then we don't have much of an advantage over that particular thing, right? If we complain about this stochastic parroting thing, then we should maybe consider ourselves as well. Are we actually only parroting what we heard at some conference? If that is the case, then maybe, you know, we don't deserve to be the humans here, and we should rather serve our new AI overlords. So, I think there is a certain risk there, right? And I know why it happens. I'm not saying we do that or any of that, of course, or any of you, but there are bad people out there in the market who suffer from the effects of certain laws like this one. You know, the actual applicability of a technology and the market rate that you get for applying it are not always positively related. So using some stuff that's totally unsuitable might give you the highest daily rate. Whereas using something that's boring is seen as a commodity, so you make more money for doing the wrong thing. Again, I'm not saying that happens all the time, but it's a risk. It's a risk that you apply something for the wrong reason. If this doesn't convince you, maybe this scientific graph will, right? Money for technology consultants and insanity level are strongly related in many companies. You know, it's totally amazing. And to maybe take an example that we all can agree on, or where I don't offend too many people, take the blockchain, right? So I was at this conference a few years ago giving a talk about blockchain. I fell for that thing as well. It just sucks. It's basically useless. I've never seen a successful project with that particular thing. And that seems to be like a, you know, by now that seems almost like a thing that you can say without getting kicked out of the room. Many people agree with that, so that's kind of okay. But if you look at the way it's still presented by some people to some decision makers, and if you look at the decisions that they actually make based on that, this is the actual graph that we're looking at. Right? So this is sort of a call for preferring simple, straightforward solutions to overly clever and complicated cool approaches. Right? Being uncool is cool. If you can do away with these 3 other persistency solutions and just use Postgres, do it. It's probably a strong improvement to your architecture, even though you're not using that super cool, fancy new thing. Of course, that does not mean that you should not evaluate things and not use, I mean that we're in the technology business, we always do the hottest shit or try to find a place for that, but not where it's unsuitable, right? So make that decision, don't be the ChatGPT of architecture. And if you want to innovate in the friggin' domain, right? Because that's what's actually important. I have a different slide, don't have it in this slide deck, but on a different slide I have this symptom of domain allergy, which I think many architects and many tech people suffer from, right? They don't want to dirty themselves with this business stuff, right? I'd rather implement an operating system or a new, I don't know, cloud runtime or something that sounds way more interesting than understanding a credit rating process. But that might actually be what makes my company its money. So I should, I think, pursue that. So let me conclude. I strongly believe that architecture is absolutely cool. It's the coolest area in IT. I have to say that because it's my day job, and I really like that because it matters. Architecture is sort of the important stuff, the stuff that's hard, that's easy to get wrong with incredibly negative side effects. So it's challenging to work on. Even if you get it right, does not mean that you always succeed, but it plays a very important role. And the fact that if you get it wrong, you can break down so many things makes it, in my view, very interesting. Unless you're allergic to that kind of thing, then don't do it. But if you want to have an impact, this is a cool area, and there are a lot of fantastic practices in that thing that help you. Even if you're consistent in staying a developer, I still think architectural work is an important thing. Whatever you do, don't fall for those one-size-fits-all solutions, right? Consider the context and to figure out what matches your actual needs, which means you have to understand them first. And once you've done that, don't aim for perfection. Rather, aim for evolvability. I'm not sure that's a word, but I strongly mean it, right? It's like you have to be able to change certain things. And again, there are multiple strategies for achieving that, and which one matches your needs best is a matter of context. And with that, that's all I have, and thank you for listening.